Hi and welcome into the second lesson called What Should You Do When You Can't Attack? In the previous lesson, we were talking about one simple question that is the key to most of the middle game positions. I hope that you remember this question really well by this point. It is, what can I attack on opponent's territory? And now let's try to answer that question. That'll be the topic of this lesson. So, what do you think? What should you attack? What should be your target in the middle game? The first answer to this question is relatively obvious. The purpose of a chess game is to checkmate opponent's king, and therefore it's the first idea that probably comes to your mind when you think about the object of your attack. You should attack opponent's king. That does make sense for sure, and in some positions it is indeed the right plan. How would you play here as white? What do you think? Actually, this is still a theoretical position. It's a dragon variation of Sicilian defense. If you play this opening line, maybe you just know what to do. Here white has the pretty well-known plan. It is to start pushing the h-pawn forward, pushing it to h4, then pushing forward to h5, trade off this pawn, and in this way you can open the h-file for your rook. Then you can also play bishop h6 to trade off the g7 bishop, which is the defender of black's king, and by doing all these maneuvers you may hope to really deliver the checkmate along the h-file somewhere on h8. The plan is very straightforward, very effective, and white won many games just by doing something like this. To conclude in this position, the plan of direct attack of opponent's king is really the best, and it's really what white should be doing. However, there are many other middle game positions when attacking of opponent's king is simply impossible. It just doesn't work. Let's take a look. This is another position. It may arise from the English opening. How would you attack opponent's king in this situation if you're playing white? You may notice that it's a pretty difficult goal, really. If you focus your attention on the quarter of a chessboard around black's king, you will notice that it's surrounded by many defenders. If required, black can easily bring even more pieces towards his king to protect it. And if you think of the white's pieces and how white can transfer more pieces closer to opponent's king, there is no obvious way to do that, and at least it's very difficult and will take a lot of time. Now, bottom line, it's really difficult for white to develop a successful attack of opponent's king. By the way, this idea to focus your attention for a moment on a certain quarter of a board and check the quantity of pieces there is a very useful thing that can help you to determine whether you can develop a successful attack in this direction or not. Anyway, let's come back to our discussion. Most of the club level players, when faced in situations like that, are simply not too sure of what to do. So attack of opponent's king does not work. And, well, of course they will be doing some moves, and white can do many different things. But, if you just play random moves which are not united by a certain guideline, by a certain plan, it's hard to hope for a big success in this game. That's why most of the players out there, they just drift around, they don't really know what to do. They will play various random moves, and if they face a strong opponent, most likely it's not going to work really well at all. And that's the problem of most of the chess players out there. But now let's think of how to deal with such situations. We're talking about objects of your attack. The first object is the most obvious idea. It is to attack opponent's king. Now, what if attack of opponent's king cannot work in a given position. In fact, if you start thinking about the eventual options, you will notice that there are very few of them, really. You can either attack opponent's king, or pieces, or pawns. If opponent's king is unreachable for you, you have to choose between his pieces and pawns. Pieces are too mobile. Normally, if you take any of the opponent's pieces, knight, bishop, rook, or queen, they all control lots of squares and always can run away from your attack. Therefore, you cannot really hope to capture opponent's piece. Sometimes that may happen, but it's rather an occasional situation and rather something exceptional. That's why the only other realistic goal target that you may have it is to attack the opponent's pawns. To conclude, there are only two available objects for your attack. It is either opponent's king or opponent's pawns. It may sound very straightforward, but most of your opponents, when they can't attack your king, they just don't know what to do at all. So even if you understand this simple idea, you're already way ahead of most of your current opponents. Now let's see how that works in a practical game. Coming back to our original example, White may decide here to use the power of his fianchettoed bishop, which looks towards Black's queenside, and White may decide to strengthen his pressure in this area of the board and just develop his attack there. For example, White may play rook to b1, preparing advancement of his b-pawn. For example, if Black plays something like bishop e6 to develop a piece, White may really push the b-pawn forward, expanding on the queenside, and now White already threatens to play b5, and once the knight goes away somewhere, White can capture the pawn on b7. You can see that just a few moves were made, and already White has real chances to win opponent's pawn. Well, of course, I'm not saying that it's going to happen that easily. Your opponent will protect his pawn, but you can keep attacking. For example, if he plays rook b8 to protect the pawn, you can play b5 to kick away the knight, and after knight to e7 you may think about new ways to attack opponent's pawns. Can you come up with any ideas? Actually, there may be several options. One of them is to play queen a4, attacking another pawn. This time it's the pawn on a7. Once again, I'm not saying that you're going to win something right away, but you will keep attacking, and sooner or later you have very good chances to win opponent's pawn. The problem with pawns is that they are relatively immobile. They cannot move that much, and very often they just can move to one square. For instance, if you compare it with the pieces, when the Black's knight was attacked on c6, Black could run away very easily. He can run away from the queenside and you cannot attack this knight anymore. But this doesn't work this way when it comes to pawns. The pawns are static, and you can just keep attacking them, and your opponent cannot remove them to another part of the board, really. Additionally, there is another interesting idea that I'd like to share with you. As we discussed at the beginning of this example, Black is protecting his king really well. As you can see, it is surrounded by many of his pieces. And that is why it is so difficult for White to develop successful attack on opponent's king. At the same time, there is something positive for you here. The fact that your opponent concentrated most of his pieces around his king means that his other flank is left unprotected. It is abandoned by his forces. If you focus your attention on the Black's queen side, you will notice that it doesn't have many defenders at all. That's why you have great chances to attack there and to gain something nice for you. At this point you may have a doubt. If goal of a chess game is to checkmate opponent's king, then why should you pursue opponent's little, meaningless, insignificant pawn? So what's the whole point of this? Well, indeed, the goal of the chess game is to checkmate the opponent's king, and sometimes, if possible, you can just go for this plan. However, as we already know, very often in many positions, this plan will simply not work, because your opponent's king is very well protected. In order to overcome in the battle, your army needs to be stronger than opponent's army. Does it make sense? For sure. That's why if you cannot attack opponent's king right away, before doing so, you need to obtain a certain advantage. In this case, your plan will be a little bit more complicated. It will be a two-step plan when compared to one-step plan of direct attack of opponent's king. So when it's a two-steps plan, as a first step, you obtain a certain advantage, and then by using this advantage, by using your superior position, you can start successful attack of opponent's king and win the game, which will be the second step. Here you may wonder whether an extra pawn is really that kind of advantage that can give you a superior position. Actually, this is a doubt that many club-level players have, and I would even say that it's one of the very common misunderstandings. Very often players treat pawn as something not very significant, and they play carelessly with pawns, they advance it, weaken them, and if they can sacrifice a pawn or lose a pawn, they don't care about that much. And it's a big mistake. An extra pawn is a huge advantage. And now let's see why. How would you evaluate this position? Well, you can see that there are many different factors that you may think about here. For example, white's king is exposed, although black's king is a bit exposed too. Black's bishop is centralized, but white has extra rook, not extra rook, but active rook on b7. So, at first sight, you may think like it's an unclear position. But in reality, it's not the case. This position is totally winning for white, thanks to his extra pawn on d5. Yes, due to this one little pawn, the position becomes totally winning for white. And just remember this idea. An extra pawn is a winning advantage. Of course, there are some exceptional situations when your opponent has a compensation or something else, but normally, if we talk about a standard position and white side has an extra pawn, it's totally winning. And it's not just about this pawn by itself. The pawn provides many other advantages. For example, in the current situation, you can see that the white's extra pawn on d5 controls a couple of squares, like e6, c6, and even the d5 square itself, where black cannot place his pieces. Also, for example, you can see that the pawn on d5 blockades the diagonal for black's bishop, as otherwise black would be able to capture white's rook on b7, but now it's impossible for him. And of course, if there is no white's pawn on d5, white would be unable to fix his rook on b7. White would be unable to invade in black's territory. So that's one good thing about an extra pawn. It does provide you extra control over many important squares of the board. Now let's move on. It's not all of the advantages that an extra pawn can provide. You also can use an extra pawn to fix your piece on a strong outpost square. For example, if we imagine that black moves away his queen somewhere, white can maneuver his bishop through the g4 square to e6, using the fact that this square is protected by the pawn. White can fix his bishop on a very advanced active square, and it will be really annoying for black. That's another advantage that this extra pawn can provide. And the list goes on. For example, white has this active rook on b7, which controls many squares in black's territory, and in a normal situation black may want to wish to trade off this rook. For example, to play something like rook f7 and exchange off the queens to neutralize white's very active piece. However, due to white's extra pawn, black will have to avoid the exchanges. Because if we imagine that we traded off all of the pieces, white will have the easily winning pawn endgame. Let's just imagine it for a second. It is the same position when all of the pieces are exchanged. In a pawn endgame, it's easily winning for white. White has this passed pawn on d5, and black's king will have to guard it, so black will have to bring his king somewhere to d6 just to blockade this pawn, because otherwise it will be promoted, and white will be able to do whatever he wants. White can bring his king, for example, towards black's pawns and just take them all. So white can do whatever, and it will be easily winning. Coming back to the actual game, let's see what happened next. White played rook to e7, black retreated with the bishop, and here white just pushed his extra pawn forward. He played d6. Of course, another obvious and big advantage of an extra pawn is that you can simply promote it into a new queen. Like if white can really advance the pawn and promote it, he'll get an extra piece and will win easily. The good thing for you here is that you have a clear plan of what to do. While black needs to think what is the right plan for him, you have a very clear idea just to advance your extra passed pawn. So black played rook d8. Now you can see another drawback of black's position. Because black has to keep an eye on this pawn, now he has to use his powerful piece, a rook, just to blockade this pawn. And therefore he cannot use this rook for an attack, because otherwise black would wish to place this rook on b8, being able to attack white's position. However, instead he has to keep it on a passive position just to blockade the pawn. Please pay attention to another interesting thing. If you look at the white's queen on d2, you can see that it has a lot of squares along the d-file. And at the same time, if you look at black's rook on d8, it currently has only 2 available squares. When you have an extra pawn and you start advancing it, it gives you a space advantage, and therefore it provides more opportunities for your pieces, and therefore you get more active position. White really used this opportunity and played queen to d5 check, starting to invade in black's camp. If black now plays king h8, the most natural move, white can play queen to e5, and you can see that white is just totally dominating. Black has so many problems in the position. Currently the rook is attacked and it's also pinned. Black cannot remove it because his king is standing behind this rook. If black tries to finally get rid of that extra pawn of white and take it, white can continue with the rook to f7, creating a threat to that rook on f6 which is pinned, and also creating a threat of checkmate with queen to e8. Black is defenseless against these both threats, and therefore it's losing for him. As we can see, ultimately white can deliver a checkmate, but it was all thanks to the extra pawn that he had, which provided him a superior position. Conclusions. The single key question to help you find the right moves in most of the middle game positions is this: what can I attack on opponent's territory? As a reply to this question, mainly you have 2 options. You can either attack opponent's king, or you may attack his pawns. If you can directly attack opponent's king and checkmate it, that's great. However, in many positions it will be impossible. In that case, you will need to obtain a certain advantage first, and only then develop an attack of an opponent's king. In order to obtain this advantage, very often you need to attack and capture opponent's pawns. 1 extra pawn is a winning advantage. If you can get it in a normal position, you get a totally winning position. Finally, let me congratulate you. Although these ideas may seem easy and even obvious, just think about your opponents and whether many of them understand these ideas clearly or not. Rest assured, most of them don't understand this clearly at all. Instead, they have a mixture of various ideas about chess game, which can hardly be applied in a practical game. And now you have a total clarity of what to do in middle game. That's why let me congratulate you with this nice fact.